The mama bear came out and she instinctively grabbed her firearm and went outside to confront him to try to get him to leave.
We are the Armed Attorneys. Today we're doing something a little bit different. We've got law partner and fellow armed attorney Leslie Cross here with us. Welcome, Leslie.
Thank you for having me.
So Leslie is in the courtroom a ton, and we're going to talk through some recent war stories she's had that I think really dispel the myth that if you do the right thing, either you won't be arrested or your case will get dismissed very quickly. The judge will dismiss your case, right? All of these things. So stay tuned. We're going to hear about the bloody trespasser who ultimately was able to assault a security guard and get away with it, at least for a little while, and a victim of domestic violence who was charged with a second-degree felony for defending herself against her abuser. But before we get rolling, show your support for the Second Amendment by hitting the like button. And so let's talk about it. I mean, I think, is there anything you want to say before we get started on the stories?
Sure. I mean, I agree with what you're saying. I mean, 100%. I get people come in and say, well, I acted in self-defense. Why was I arrested? Why are they not dismissing it? Can I talk to the judge? Can I have the judge dismiss it? And unfortunately, self-defense is that. It's a defense that you get to use in a courtroom. So not a bar to prosecution and not a bar to being arrested.
Well, let's talk, first of all, why doesn't the judge dismiss their cases?
Because essentially the judge doesn't have the power to dismiss the cases. The only reason that the judge could dismiss the case prior to an actual trial in front of the judge would be prosecutorial misconduct. And normally that's not what we're alleging. So the judge just doesn't have the ability to do that.
No. And even sometimes you see someone file a speedy trial motion with a request for dismissal because speedy trial is violated. Even then, I see judges, like, they might even grant the motion for speedy trial. Like, look, you guys have been on the docket a long time, the state's dragging their feet, but they're generally going to mark out the request for dismissal, right?
100%.
So, I mean, it just doesn't happen. So, with that said, give us a war story.
Sure, yeah. So recently I had a case where a client was a security guard and he was working on New Year's Eve in a park, and his job was at midnight to clear the park. And so that's what he was doing. And in the process of doing so, there was a drunk individual who at this point was a trespasser because he had been asked to leave and he was intoxicated. He wouldn't leave. Prior to my client showing up, this trespasser had cut his hand. So he was actively bleeding from his hand. He kept coming towards my client with a bloody hand. My client didn't know if he had any sort of diseases, and he just wanted space. And so my client kept telling him, hey, you need to back up. You need to back up. Please give me space. They were waiting for the police to come, and my client kept backing up, and the trespasser would just keep coming towards my client. So eventually my client actually kind of pushed the trespasser away to give him some space. And ultimately, when the police showed up, they determined that my client was in the wrong, that he did not act in any sort of self-defense. This was also defense of property because at this point, he was trying to get the trespasser to leave the park. The park was closed. This was what his job was. And you can use force against a trespasser. And the police officer actually didn't even get a statement from my client. The police officer basically just said, hey, tell us about the part where you pushed him. So everything leading up to that, the police didn't care about. And that was very vital to this case. And the case actually went on for over a year. So for a year, my client had to show up to court every month. My client lost his ability to be a security guard because he lost his security license. And then he just had this hanging over his head for over a year. We set it for trial and we went to a pretrial conference, and it was the day before pretrial when I ultimately was able to speak to the chief of the court, who actually took the time to look at the case. And when we walked in for pretrial, we were told that the case was dismissed. But that's a year of waiting. That's a year of having the stress. He had to come in and meet with me multiple times.
You know, I think it's particularly egregious, too, because imagine being at your job. Your job is to protect property. And you are trying to do your job. Exactly. And Leslie makes a great point, which is that in the state of Texas, and, you know, many states have similar laws, if someone is trespassing on property that is yours or you have been contracted to defend, such as by a security guard company, right, you get to use force to remove that trespasser from your property. So not only do we have you're at your job, if the guy was just sitting quietly on the lawn,
right,
you should be able by law to grab him and move him off the lawn. But you have a bloody, intoxicated person, right? I don't know if you mentioned that.
Right, intoxicated.
Intoxicated, bleeding, coming at you, and you're retreating. And then when you push your hands out, you're arrested and your life is ruined, essentially.
It is.
I mean, that's tough. Plus, not to mention, we're not free, right?
Right. 100%.
I mean, and that's really tough too, because, not only you would pay a lawyer retainer, when it gets all the way up to trial, I mean, the trial costs money too.
They do.
Not only are we talking about time, jobs, reputation, finances, I mean, you can't rely on the justice system to actually do justice.
Nope,
right?
Not at all.
And that's not even the worst story you have recently.
Right. So I have another story where I have a client. This one was very egregious to me. My client was actually a victim of domestic violence. So she had been in an abusive relationship with the father of her children. They were no longer in a relationship other than co-parenting together. He came to her apartment and she was in a car with another gentleman. He got upset about that. So she, to make sure everything went smoothly, told the other gentleman, hey, go ahead, leave. This isn't a place for you. And the other gentleman left. At that point, she tried to go back to her apartment. The aggressor came up and ended up pulling her hair to try to get her to come back.
Which is what?
Assault.
Right.
Assault, yes.
Start there.
Right. So he had already assaulted her. She was able to get away and get inside, but she had her children inside. And he came around to the other side of the apartment and started banging on the door. And it was a glass door, and she was scared for her kids. The mama bear came out, and she instinctively grabbed her firearm and went outside to confront him to try to get him to leave so the kids wouldn't be scared and so the kids would be safe, because she was concerned that he ultimately would kick down the door and possibly assault her in front of her children, which she didn't want to have happen. So when she went outside and confronted him again, he ended up chasing her through her apartment complex and ultimately had her cornered. And so she ended up firing a shot into the ground, which I never say that warning shots are a good idea, but this was a situation where she kind of knew what was going to happen if he got a hold of her. And so she didn't want that to happen. The police showed up. And what's crazy is that the aggressor, the father of her children, told the police the same exact story. Admitted basically to assaulting her. He was never arrested, though. And within a week of her being arrested, he actually called the DA's office and told them that he wanted these charges dismissed. He didn't want the case to go forward. She was a good person, and that he wouldn't show up at trial to testify against her. This went on for a year again, was set for trial. My client lost her job. She actually had to find a new job in order to support her children, which she did. And ultimately, right before trial, they ended up dismissing it after, again, they reached out to the alleged victim in this case, and he said that he would not come testify.
And that's crazy to me, because in most circumstances where you have two parties and you're alleging self-defense, that other party is not telling the same story that you're telling.
Right, yeah. They never say that they were the one who was attacking you or coming after you.
Right. No one is ever going to admit, like, oh, yeah, well, I assaulted him first, then he took out his gun to defend himself. Never is that going to happen, except in this case, it actually happened, and it didn't mean anything.
Nothing. They did not care. Did not care.
It really is. I mean, I hope that these war stories are a little bit helpful to you guys in just looking at the reality of having to get into a defensive incident. Leslie, do you have any kind of general advice for people in kind of living their life, with this in mind?
I mean, my advice is always, if you're going to use self-defense or defense of any sort, make sure that it is the last line of possibility that you have. Because if you are in a situation where you are wrapped up in the court system, if it's something where it was your life versus someone else's life, then you're probably going to be okay with that. But if there's some other way that you could handle it, I would recommend trying to do that first, because getting caught up in the justice system, especially when you think you're doing something right, just isn't worth it.
And that's, if you watch this channel, all you've heard Richard and I say over and over again, that even if you live in a stand your ground state, making, a line of retreat, making self-defense your last possible resort to preserve your life or someone else's life, not legally necessary in a stand your ground state, but so incredibly important, because, best case scenario, you're in the court system for a year, and out tens of thousands of dollars. And, it is, unfortunate but true that the self-defender, I think, is just punished more and more these days. So I think you just have to be incredibly cautious, and you always win the fight you avoid, right?
100%.
Well, thank you for watching. If you like this content, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, and help us fight the anti-2A algorithm by sharing this video. And as always, question and comment for us below. Until next time, we're the Armed Attorneys.